What's your story on the West Bank that you recovered? Is this a story you had previously written, or is this something you're kind of repurposing and taking bits from for a new story?
It was, kind of repackaged. So when do you want to, how do you want to start here?
We can go. We're going right now.
Okay.
Roll into it.
Yeah. So I lived in the Middle East. You could say I visited, but it was like I was there for almost a year. And I went after college and I didn't have anything else to do. It was like I graduated from journalism school, trying to figure out what I really wanted to do. And I was kind of leaning more towards like, let's go out there and like do foreign dispatches for Rolling Stone from, the far corners of the globe and stuff, rather than go work for, the Time Standard covering the cops and whatever that most people out of journalism school have to do. I was kind of wanting to do an end run around that and be special. So I went to the Middle East and I had taken all these courses in the Middle East and I went to college in the late 70s. So the Middle East was starting to really cook up. It was like the energy crisis and the Camp David Accords under Carter, and all this stuff was going on. And I was fascinated by it, and I took every course I could. I went to Northwestern. Took every class I could that had to do with the Middle East. And by the time I graduated, then I went over there and thought I could maybe hang out, do some writing for Rolling Stone, or I met the bureau chief of the Washington Post in Jerusalem. I met the Time Magazine bureau chief in Jerusalem, and I was kind of hanging out in their offices and seeing, there's like, hey, maybe there's a story I can do kind of thing. It's like this kid right out of school trying to do something. And so during that time that I was there, I had a whole bunch of different on-the-ground experiences. And, when we talk about the Middle East, Israel, Palestine, Gaza, there's a whole lot of stuff you've heard or you've read. And I thought, well, I went there and my impressions of what's going on in the Middle East, what has been going on, what's going on now, was born out of a real sojourn there and meeting people there. And that's different than reading about it, even though I have read a lot about it since then. There's just something about going to a place and meeting those people and talking to those people and just sort of immersing yourself in that culture that's, I think, a little different than reading about it and watching YouTube videos about it. So obviously what's going on in Gaza really cranked up and suddenly everybody's talking about Palestinians, and the campuses are exploding and Cal Poly's having, riots break out and all this stuff is going on about the Palestinians in Gaza. And I was at first kind of taken aback. Like, there's been trouble in Gaza for decades. Why is this of interest now? And maybe, that's a good question for you, your generation, it's like, maybe this is brand new stuff. I don't know. But having watched numerous wars and blockades and, all this kind of stuff going on around Gaza, suddenly everybody was really focused on it, looking at it, and they had to talk about it in the presidential election and stuff. So I thought that was a good development in the sense that people are thinking about, can we solve this problem in the Middle East? Can we solve the Palestinian situation? Can we resolve it, shall we say? And I thought about the story I'd written. I wrote the story and I tried to get Rolling Stone and Mother Jones, and I sent it out, after I got back. It was a story about foreign aid workers in the West Bank and Gaza. People who are there, mostly religious groups like American Friends Service Committee or Mennonite Central Committee, not U.S. aid per se, no, not a government thing, although what ends up happening is the government sends a lot of money to those NGOs to do this stuff. But when I went out there, I was able to tour the West Bank and Gaza in the van of this guy. I'll call him Abu Hana. His name is Ibrahim Mater, and he worked for the American Friends Service Committee, which is Quakers. Quakers out of the United States have this thing, and they fund, and they still do, but they were heavily funding agricultural development in the West Bank and Gaza at the time. And so Ibrahim, or let's just call him Abu Hana, he would take me in his van and we'd drive around. And I'd go with him to some of his meetings and some of his consultations, or whatever. And his job was agricultural development. So what he was trying to do is trying to get Palestinian farmers to get better yields and stuff out of what they were doing. So, for instance, he might come across a Palestinian farmer who's growing grapes, and the grapes are just growing out on the ground. The Palestinian farmer hasn't been taught or isn't aware of trellising, putting grapes up on fences and wires and stuff. They're just growing on the ground. And when you grow grapes out on the ground, which is what they will not naturally do if you plant grapevines, half of them get smashed just by being on the ground and, gravity. And
so a more effective farming technique.
It's more effective to trestle, and Europeans have been doing this for a long time, obviously, but a lot of the Palestinian farmers weren't familiar with that technique. And so Ibrahim would go out and he'd do these kind of things. And so I got to go to Gaza with him, and he wasn't really doing agriculture in Gaza, and the Gaza and the West Bank are really, really different. So the West Bank is very large, and it has a lot of established Arab villages that have been around for centuries, and Gaza was a refugee camp that was, in a sense, born out of the 1948 war, and all of these Arabs, Palestinians, who lived along the coast, the Mediterranean coast of what we now call Israel, were fleeing their homes because the war had broken out. And so they fled towards Egypt and set up refugee camps. They couldn't necessarily go into Egypt. They were coming out of Ashkelon and Ashdod and even Jaffa and some other places, Beersheba, and they were coming to the coast, and they set up this refugee camp. And then when I got there, this was 30, 40 years later, they're still there in a refugee camp. They got sewage running down the middle of the street. They managed to build more permanent structures. And ironically, people who had come there maybe as infants in their mother's arms to flee the war were now grandparents, and generation after generation of Palestinians were living in Gaza. And this refugee camp became kind of this urban city kind of thing, but it was a slum. And Abu Hana was showing me how they were trying to do some projects to help with the housing. He showed me this one building where they had come in and redone the roof, and they had put in some kind of asbestos reinforced concrete or something so the roof wouldn't leak, because this roof had leaked for decades. And he said, I'm just ashamed that I can come in here and I can bring in some Western money to the American Friends and I can help patch this roof up, but I can't do anything to help this 100-year-old woman who's laying in rags on the floor. I can't really improve her life. And what I found and what the story is about, and this story is now on my Truthsmack publication. So that's that's Stephen Saint at stephensaint.substack.com, Truthsmack. I wrote this story about how the aid workers were constantly being frustrated by the military occupation. And that's something that I think Americans didn't quite understand, the sort of the status of the West Bank and Gaza being not really part of Israel and not really on its own, but being part of this limbo of military occupation. So the military was, and this is still the case, the Israeli military is the final authority in the West Bank and Gaza. There's some autonomy, and this has been going on obviously since the Oslo Accords were signed, the idea of the Palestinian Authority. So the PLO, which was largely a militaristic kind of group, using what you might call terrorism to get their point across, put on suits and ties and became Fatah, and political force that was able to organize a government for the West Bank. They were not the government for Gaza. The Gazans were, in a sense, kind of turned against them. So they elected a group called Hamas.
And did they turn against them? My understanding is that there was some idea that the PLO was more influenced by the government in Israel.
Well, that was the perception. But when I was there was no Hamas, and there was no Palestinian Authority.
Was there any leadership in Gaza at that point?
Well, leadership is going to arise, but there wasn't any kind of political autonomy, all military occupation. And so the aid workers were constantly frustrated because everything they wanted to do for anybody, they had to give to the Israeli military. And the Israeli military could say yes or no, or most of the time, just not get back to you. It's like,
leave you in limbo.
Thanks for that proposal. We'll get back to you. 2 years later, you never heard back from them. So in a way, they didn't say no, but they didn't say yes. And that kind of limbo was just really part of the culture there. So what I came away with and what I was hoping to kind of express as we, and feel free to like probe what you're interested in about Gaza and this whole conflict, but how to understand the Arab world, I think is part of the problem, that we Americans don't understand them. And I'll be the first to say that I have yet to meet an American politician that understands the Middle East. When I got back from this year over there, I went back to Northwestern. I was hanging out with some of my friends that hadn't graduated yet, and I was kind of just, couch surfing a little bit and getting ready to go back to California. And one of my friends says, "Hey, George McGovern is going to be lecturing in my political science class." I'm like, cool. You've heard of George McGovern. George McGovern had run for president, right? He ran against Richard Nixon and lost in 1972. So he was, a decade or two later, he was still around in the Senate. In fact, George McGovern was the highest ranking Democrat in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So in a sense, this elder statesman, this guy who's been around the block, sitting on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, supposedly the most knowledgeable guy about the Middle East that you could find in Congress. And so I'm like, I want to hear what he has to say. So I went and listened, and it's been a long time and I don't remember all the questions he was asked. But the thing that stuck out to me is someone asked about the status of Jerusalem and the U.S. Embassy moving to Jerusalem. And George McGovern said to this auditorium full of people that we need to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and we need to move our embassy there. And my jaw just hit the ground. Having been there for 10 months, I knew that that's the last thing you want to do if you want to have any kind of chance for peace in the Middle East. You can't just unilaterally say, forget international law, forget the United Nations, forget all the agreements we've made. Let's just do something. Let's just do it anyway. I mean, you just can't do that. And that kind of imperial hubris, I thought, okay, no wonder we're lost as a country if this is the kind of leadership we have that has no understanding of what is going on in this other world that operates really differently than we do. So let me just give you some tips on understanding the Arab world. First of all, calling it the Arab world is kind of a misnomer. Calling it the Middle East is kind of a misnomer. It's like we have these little phrases, right? But what we're talking about is a very diverse area, very diverse. So not everybody in the Arab world is an Arab. You might be able to trace a sort of a genetic ethnicity. Certain areas are Arabic, and like Arabia, okay, there's the word right there. Arabia, what we call Iraq, what we call Syria, what we call Palestine, what we call Jordan, a lot of Arabs, people who are from that ethnic group speaking that language. But you've got other people, like you've got Egyptians, and Egyptians are not Arabs. Egyptians are Northern Africans, and up until the Mohammedan conquest of 622 or whatever it was, they were Egyptians. They had pharaohs, they had their own language. They had even been highly Christianized after the first century because Jesus was right next door, and the Apostle Mark went over there and started the Coptic church. And so Egyptians are not Arabs, but thanks to Muhammad, they were conquered and given Arabic as their language. So Egyptians have a language compatibility or a similarity to Arabs in Palestine, Syria, whatever, but they are ethnically different and they have, kind of some different traditions there. Turks are not Arabs. Turks have their own languages. And on and on. The Iranians or Persians are not Arabs. So you've got, in the Arab world, you got a lot of people who aren't Arabs. You got people who are Arabs. You got a lot of people who speak Arabic. And that sort of Islamic conquest had a lot to do with the propagation of Arabic as a language, because in Islam, you can really only read the Quran in Arabic. It's not like in Christianity where the Bible was readily translated into different languages from the beginning. It was in Greek, and then it was in Latin, and on and on. But the Islamic concept was a little bit more like Judaism, where Hebrew is like the religious language, and you read Torah in Hebrew. You can read it in any other language. It's not that you can't translate it. And of course, the Quran has been translated, but in terms of its formal use, you have to recite it in Arabic. So the propagation of Arabic and Islam kind of go hand in hand. And then you have people who are in the Arab world who are not Muslims. So, at the time I was in Palestine, half the Arab population was non-Muslim. They were mostly Christians. And those Christian communities started way back in the first century when Jesus was there. And they have maintained their residency and their culture and their things there. So there are a lot of Christian Arabs. And then, of course, Islam comes along in the 600s, and there's more Muslims. So you've got all this diversity. And so trying to pull this all together is really challenging because so much diversity. The second thing to remember is that Islam has two major versions. And you've heard these words, the Sunnis and the Shia. And I would roughly compare this to the Catholics and the Protestants. The Sunnis are like the Catholics. They're kind of like the original group coming out of Muhammad, having, when Muhammad died, there was a question about who would succeed him. Would he have a successor? Would there be more prophets? Would there be whatever? So they had to go through this whole kind of governance, leadership kind of question. And they kind of came up with a couple different answers. So the Sunni came up with one answer. We're going to follow this guy as the successor to Muhammad. And then the Shia said, no, we're going to follow this guy. And the Shia felt there needed to be a genetic connection to Muhammad, whereas the Sunni didn't. So like anybody could be what they ended up calling the caliph. That's not exactly the same as the prophet, but the caliph is kind of like the pope. And anybody could be a caliph, where in Shia it's a little more complicated. And then their successor to Muhammad vanished. And so there's a whole bunch of different Shia approaches to, is he coming back? Like the second coming of the Imam or whatever. So the reason that that's important is because Saudi Arabia is the heir apparent to the Sunni world, and Iran is the heir apparent to the Shia world. And these two worlds collide in the Persian Gulf, in Iraq and especially in Iraq and some in the Emirates and some in Syria, but where there are a lot of Shia. So that complicates things, and yet it kind of makes things more understandable, because when you understand that Saudi Arabia and Iran have been fighting over who's really right here for a few centuries, that everything that's happening now can be seen a little more clearer through the idea of we're watching a little bit of a war between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and they're wanting us to be on their side. They want people to be on their side. They're battling for ascendancy. And so anytime, we get cozy with Iran, Saudi Arabia gets nervous, and vice versa. A third thing that I think is really important about understanding the Arab world is the face-saving culture. So I don't know I don't know what kind of culture you come from, Nick Flores. Maybe you got some macho Hispanic guys back there, and nobody calls me chicken. And maybe there's a kind of machismo kind of thing somewhere in your family you're aware of. That's true for a lot of cultures. The machismo thing is not just Hispanic, it's Arabic too. But this face-saving culture where if someone's been insulted, then we have to kind of fight to the death. Okay? I'm sorry, but this is a fight to the death. And of course, Westerners did that too. It's called duels, right? So that kind of thing. Now, the important thing to remember about this face-saving culture is that you can negotiate and you can diffuse conflicts, but you need a third-party negotiator. Because what we need to do is, like, say you and I are hitting loggerheads. By God, you're wrong. No, you're wrong. No, you're wrong. I'm going to kill you. I'm going to kill you and everyone in your family. And the threats escalate. And Arabs are very dramatic. Okay, they're very dramatic. And they're yelling and they're screaming, and you think, oh my God, someone's going to kill somebody. And then you look over and they're hugging each other and walking away. It's like, wow. So we get into this disagreement, and someone's lost face, so you get a third party. Third party comes over and says, hey, Nick, I know you can kick his ass, but for me, don't do it. And you go, okay, I will kick your ass, but for him, I'm not going to do it. And so for the third party guy is super important in diffusing conflicts, because then you can save face. I could nail you 10 times with one hand behind my back, but I'm not going to do it because of him, because he asked me. I owe him something, and he's an honorable person, so I'm going to do it. So when you see these negotiations going on about whether it's a ceasefire or this or that, or the Oslo Accords or the Camp David, all this stuff, there's always a third-party mediation going. There's always somebody else. There's the Emirates are coming in, or the Turks. The Turks are huge for doing this, because the Turks have a unique place in the whole mosaic, because they're not Arabs, and they shed their religious state at the end of World War I. So they became highly secularized. The Turks did, and the last thing that looked like a caliphate and a governance organization for the religion of Islam was the Ottoman Empire. And when the Ottoman Empire collapsed, the people who took over Turkey were huge into secularization. Just, forget the religion stuff. It's just driving everybody crazy. Forget it. No more caliph, no more sultans. Let's just get on with voting and, having a modern country. So the Turks have a real interesting place in third-party negotiations, and they're usually doing something to try to diffuse things. And then, I can go on and on. Tribalism is huge. This is a mosaic, a landscape of people who are in tribes. And so their clan and tribal identifications are really important and strong. So you have a hard time getting them to be like united or a country. it was clear when we went into Iraq that, Iraq exploded into a civil war once we toppled Saddam Hussein, because Saddam Hussein came in, and Saddam Hussein was a secularist. He was not religious. He just wanted power. And he basically told everybody, I'm going to kick your ass if you don't do this. And so he held together these basically three groups in Iraq: the Sunnis, the Shia, and the Kurds. And once he was gone, all hell broke loose and nobody else could do it. The United States couldn't do it, spent 20 years trying to do it and couldn't do it. Tribalism is a huge challenge because people have their identities and they have their grudges and they hold on to that. And it's a very big challenge to kind of get around that. And the idea that they're going to all put on suits and ties and be like, like an English parliament or something, it's just not going to happen most of the time. It's going to take a long time. So the imposition of nationalism from a Western point of view has kind of been a lost cause. And the last thing I'm going to say, and then I'll let you do whatever you want to do, and that is that everything that you think is bad behavior by those Arabs or those Muslims, everything you would think is a really bad behavior by those people has all been done by Americans and Westerners as well. The biggest, I think one of the biggest, obstacles to really peacemaking in the world is that everybody wants to think that they're right and they've never done anything wrong. And all the bad people and the wrong stuff and the terrorism and that's all them. It's like believe it or not, everything that the Taliban has done to women in Afghanistan, Westerners did to women as well. I mean, women couldn't even vote in this country till about 100 years ago. I mean, women couldn't vote. They had no rights. In England, women couldn't inherit anything. They had to go, watch Pride and Prejudice. They had to go off and marry some guy because the property was all given patriarchal. So, the eldest son was getting everything. He didn't get just one he got everything, and then the daughters have to find some guy to marry that's going to take care of them and stuff. So everything that those Arabs have done to women, we did to women. Okay. And every act of terrorism that these people have done, we have done. We have tortured and waterboarded and black-sided people. So this holier than thou stuff that somehow we got it together and they don't, we're going to show them how to do it, has really got to be thrown aside. And some humility needs to come in and say, we've been trying to figure out how to treat women right too. We haven't done a very good job, but we're maybe getting better. Maybe. Depends on which women you talk to. So get off the high horse and start talking to real people about real things and sharing what we hope the world could become instead of this, or I think it's just really unnecessarily mud wrestling about every little thing and always having a holier than thou position, especially on social media. It just seems like the most holy people in the world are on social media.
Done no wrong and can cast judgment from a place of holiness. What was the sentiment like when you first went over there from the state's perspective? Were people invested in Palestine at that point?
No. And that was kind of the eye-opener for me. Okay, so I'll admit it. I went over in 1980. Okay, that's like a long time ago. Okay, so I'm an old guy. But when I went over there, I was fresh out of college. And there had been some talk about Palestinians, and there had been some talk about the Arab-Israeli conflict, obviously. But I remember I had a badge that said, "We are all Zionists." And I think this badge was being handed out maybe by the Jewish students on campus. We had a Hillel group on campus. Maybe they were handing them out. But the United Nations was going through this whole thing about, is Zionism a form of racism? And the UN had tried to and then eventually did pass a resolution saying that Zionism was a form of racism. And the Jewish community and the American community at large was basically outraged by this notion because I think largely because we didn't understand what Zionism was. If we understood what Zionism was, we wouldn't have necessarily worn the badge, "We are all Zionists." But we didn't understand what it was. What we understood as Americans were Jews have suffered terribly and we got to help them. And I think that's true. I mean, I think the Jewish people have been one of the most terrorized group in world history. I mean, it's just amazing how badly they've been treated for the last 2,000 years. And of course, their own history, they go back to being conquered by the Assyrians. They were conquered by the Babylonians. They were conquered by the Romans. They were conquered by the Greeks. So in some ways, they're kind of like the Irish. I'm 1/4 Irish. And I've been to Ireland and I've read a lot about the troubles in Ireland. And just like, the British came in and just like kicked ass on the Irish, and it's like they didn't have any right to do that. And they shouldn't have done that. And the Irish fought back, and there was a lot of bad decisions made, and a lot of violence was done. And it's been great to see Ireland move beyond that and sign the Good Friday Accords. And now it's been, 30, going on 40 years that the troubles have been officially over. And the IRA is no longer, blowing up post offices and coffee shops and stuff. And you can actually go from Belfast to Dublin in a car without having to go through 10 checkpoints. You can't do that in Israel right now. You gotta go through checkpoints all the time, and it's not a very peaceful place. So that was one of the things that I was able to understand was that I had some serious questions about Zionism by the time I finished my year there. I had started my year over there after my brother and I went and we toured around. We were tourists for, like 6 weeks or something. We saw the sights and did this and that. We went into Egypt together and went to Cairo, and we were kind of traveling around. He had to go back to finish school, and I was then done. And the first thing I did after our tourism segment was to go work at a kibbutz. So if people aren't familiar with kibbutz, you probably heard the word kibbutz now, but a kibbutz is a collective farm. Basically, it's a socialist village. Even you might even call it a communist village. Excuse me. I gotta get some.
There's some water right there.
I gotta get one of your reusable cups. Yeah. So I was at a place called Kibbutz Yad Mordechai, and Yad Mordechai is the closest kibbutz to the Gaza Strip, just north of it, just a few miles. And so I lived there for 2 months. And the kibbutzim is in Hebrew, or kibbutzniks. The kibbutzim have volunteers. And to be honest with you, I don't know if they still do this or not. But back in the day, and for a long time, they had like a little, on the edge of the kibbutz, a little volunteer area. And they had some bunkers and dormitories and stuff, and we would go hang out there. And most of the volunteers were from Europe. And in fact, most of the volunteers were not Jewish, like me. We were just kind of banging around looking for a way to sort of stay in without having to pay for accommodations. So you work trade for your accommodations. And so we would go out and we'd work in the fields or we'd work in the factory. They had a light bulb factory. They had chicken coops. They had a kitchen. The kibbutz had everything. It was a self-contained village. And I've never forgotten that. And I've always kind of idolized that you can actually, make a little village and be self-sustaining. And It can work, and the kibbutzniks proved that it can work. Anyway, I was at Yad Mordechai, and when I was there, I had a roommate in my little volunteer metal bunker thing named Aaron. And Aaron was this cool guy. He was an Israeli. And I got to know him because we were roommates and talked a lot. And so his story just blew my mind. He was a Jew living in Uruguay. And, Uruguay's had a whole bunch of, turmoil and a bunch of different dictators and whatever. And at the time, there was a dictator in Uruguay, and the dictator wanted everyone to sign a loyalty oath and go into the military. And Aaron was a pacifist, and he didn't want to go into the military, and he didn't want to pledge allegiance to this dictator. And so he said, no, I'm not going to do it. And so they threw him in jail. So he's sitting in jail as basically a political prisoner in Uruguay, and he figures, I got to get out of here. He was in a 1 foot by 1 foot cell. So he's like defecating on himself, and, it's just terrible
conditions.
Yeah, terrific conditions. So he tries to get out, and one of the first places he tries to get to is the United States. The United States won't take him. So he plays the Jewish card. Now, he's not particularly religious, but he is Jewish. And there's a lot of Jewish people in Latin America that came over in the World War II or the lead up to World War II, or even way before that. There's been kind of a connection there. So he appeals to Israel to let him come, and Israel says, yeah, you can come. So he comes to Israel, and the first thing that you got to do when you become an Israeli citizen is you got to be in the military. So he was like, okay.
Did he know that?
So, yeah, he knew that, but it was like, am I going to,
rot in jail, or am I going to go over here?
Yeah, exactly. How can this get any worse? So being in the military, in the Israeli IDF was a step up, So he goes into the military, and he's got to do things that he didn't want to do. And things that, the whole military occupation thing. Okay, so, just imagine you're a Palestinian, and you're walking down the street. You got 2 or 3 friends. You're walking down the street, and you run into some soldiers. And the soldiers say, let me see your ID. And so you go, okay. And the soldiers go, I'm taking this ID. And you, wait, don't take my ID. I have to have it to be on this street. You just took my ID. No, you come to the station and get it later. So now I don't have an ID. So then I get arrested for not having an ID. And nobody knows where my ID is. And I get thrown in jail for, being a suspected terrorist or something because I'm roaming around without my papers. Aaron he didn't like this. He didn't like beating up Palestinians in the street because, that eventually comes. The worst cop scenario is like, okay, let's have some fun with this guy.
Let's rough him up a little bit.
He didn't say yes, sir, in Hebrew, so let's go for it. So Aaron didn't like any of this, and then they sent him to Lebanon, and the Israelis had an invasion of Lebanon a couple years before I got there, and the Israelis have invaded Lebanon numerous times. And when they went up in, I think it was 78, Aaron went up in this thing called the Litani operation. And the purpose of the Litani operation was to overrun the northern border of Israel and drive out all of the Muslims up to the Litani River. And then give the land to the Christian Arabs of southern Lebanon. So it would create a buffer zone, and the Christian militia then would patrol this border area, and it involved displacing people, kicking them out of their villages, maybe even burning down some villages, killing people, and then handing the land over to these rivals, the Arab Christians, who were having their own problems with those Muslims, and so using that divide and conquer thing. And he formally protested that they had committed war crimes in the Litani operation, and he got sent to Israeli jail. So by the time I'm meeting him, he's been in prison in Uruguay, he's been in prison in Israel, he's had to do all of these things that he didn't believe in. So that was a real introduction to the idea that, something's going on in this country that isn't right. And even nice guys like Aaron can't handle what's going on in here. What is that? And that has to do with what is Zionism. And I'm not going to get into it too much, but this is what I came to understand as the essence of Zionism is that looking at the history of Jewish people, they will never be safe until they control a Jewish state. The world will always betray them. They will never be safe. The only way we Jews can be safe is to have our own country where Jews live and Jews control it. And so that is what we have to do. That is, I don't think is really how most people think of Zionism. I think
today?
Yeah. I'm not sure, but maybe people are understanding it better. But at the time that I was learning this, we were fighting a battle with South Africa. The world was fighting a battle with South Africa to end apartheid. And, all these, I remember all my favorite rock bands were part of Artists Against Apartheid, and we're going to boycott playing in South Africa, and we're going to divest all the divestiture on the college campuses. We're get rid of investments in South Africa, get rid of the Krugerrand, isolate South Africa, make them change their government from this apartheid, which is essentially separate and not equal, into a real democracy where everybody has rights and equal rights and stuff. And the native black Africans have the same rights as the white people do. And so the world kind of understood that apartheid wasn't right, but they didn't really see that what Israel was doing was another version of apartheid. And when I was there, Abu Hana gave me a map. I'll even show you this map. I brought it. He said, this is what's going on with the Zionist plan. And this map comes from the World Zionist Organization. It's hard to see. I'm just going to kind of show.
That's the map that he gave you?
This is the map he gave me. And you probably can't see it very well, but what you can see is that you've got some circles. And then inside those circles, you've got some dots and squares. Okay. And what this map came from the World Zionist Organization. It was published in 1978. It's called the Drobles Plan, excuse me. I'm from Southern California. I think Drobles, but it's not. It's the Drobles Plan from the World Zionist Organization. And basically what they said was, we can't have all of these Arabs becoming citizens. We need Israel to be greater Israel. We need to have all the boundaries we had under Solomon. We need to have the West Bank. We need to have the Golan. We need to have the Sinai. We need to have all this land. That's greater Israel. That's what we deserve. That's what we have a biblical claim to. But there's all these Arabs on it. And you just can't be making 1.5 million Arabs citizens, because then we've lost the Jewish control. If everybody gets a vote now, boy, it won't be long. And, they breed like rabbits. So pretty soon there will be hardly any Jews left, and they'll overrule us, and we just can't have it. So the Drobles plan was to de-Arabize the occupied territories, to build settlements around all of the bigger villages on the West Bank and in Gaza, and make life hell for the Palestinians that were there. In fact, let's give the land to the most obnoxious settlers we can possibly find. Let's find some real nutcases that'll have no problem going up to their Arab friends and spitting on them. Let's really get the militant guys in there. And one group was called the Gush Imunim, and they were notorious for just like being like the worst neighbors you could possibly think of. And let's make all these settlements around there so the Arabs will all leave. And making life miserable for Palestinians has been a plan for 40, 50, 60 years. And it goes on today. In Gaza, as we know, Israel pulled out of Gaza in 2005. Just Ariel Sharon came in and said, we're out. All the settlements are dismantled. Israelis, get out of there. I remember hearing that news and thinking, why in the world would Ariel Sharon want to all the Israelis out of Gaza? That was the whole point, is moving Israelis into all the areas. And well, now we can see what was going on. And that was my suspicion at the time, that get all the Jews out of Gaza and then we can just like bulldoze the place.
Just decimate it.
And that's happened since 2005, is that under various rationale, Israel has basically leveled the place. And so now we even have President Trump coming in and saying, hey, let the U.S. come on in and build the Riviera there. So, this is all old stuff. This was the plan since 1980. And the plan has gone ahead and unfolded. And the de-Arabization of the occupied territories continues. And in fact, we even have now tanks in the West Bank. For the first time in 20 years, I read that, the Israeli occupation of the West Bank is getting worse and worse than ever. While we think about Gaza, we think about, is there going to be a ceasefire in Gaza, which there hasn't been, but are we going to get that terrible situation resolved? Don't look at the West Bank over here. Don't look at Jenin. Don't look at Nablus, So that is the unfolding of a Zionist program that, and I was reading, so like Aaron, my roommate at Yad Mordecai, he wasn't into that. I moved to Jerusalem after my 2 months in the kibbutz. I moved to Jerusalem, and I worked in a youth hostel. Same kind of deal. I worked for room and board at the youth hostel, and so I worked at the Orthodox youth hostel in Jerusalem, and I was able to kind of travel around and meet people and go out to the West Bank. And I interviewed the head of the student body president at Birzeit University, and asked him what it was like, being a student. And he told, the military can come in anytime. They had a little parade, and they unfurled the Palestinian flag on campus. Israeli military came in, knocked the crap out of them, and closed campus. Said classes are closed. See you next year. And the guy I was talking to was really bummed. He was trying to go to college, and he couldn't finish that year because the military decided that they'd had enough flag waving. So he was out of finishing his classes. In Jerusalem, I eventually had a roommate. I met some people while I was working at the youth hostel, and I went in as a roommate, and I had an Israeli guy and another American guy, and we rented this loft, this like freezing loft, stone cinder block kind of thing over a store in a small Jewish neighborhood in West Jerusalem called Masgeret Moshe. And my roommate there, his name was Zamir. And Zamir was telling me about how he had to go down and rough up and beat up Palestinians on the West Bank, and he didn't like it. Same thing that Aaron was telling me. It wasn't like that was like an isolated incident from that one wacky guy at the kibbutz. It was like, I go up and I have another roommate, and he had the same thing happen to him, and he went to the brig because he was like a conscientious objector for some of this stuff. He wouldn't do it. And so that was an eye-opener, and I got to meet a lot of people through the foreign aid guy, Abu Hana. I got to meet the Anglican Bishop of Nazareth, So, he was a Christian Arab, and he was buddies with the mayor of Nazareth, and he was telling me all about how even though Nazareth is in Israel, okay, so that's a little bit of a twist. Not everything is in the West Bank. Nazareth is part of Israel proper, and all the Arabs living in Nazareth or living in Haifa or Netanya or whatever, those Arabs got citizenship when the state of Israel was created, those people living in there. But they weren't allowed to really oppose the policies. At the time, there were no Arabic parties allowed in the Knesset. So all the Arabs were joining the Communist Party because the Communist Party was the only party that questioned Zionism, or one of the few parties that questioned that whole way of doing Israel. And they weren't communists. Father Riach was an Anglican bishop. He wasn't a godless communist, but that was the party he could belong to. And there were Jews in that party too, and they could actually get up in the Knesset, their members, and ask questions and make demands and whatever. So the impression I got from meeting all of these people was that really Israel is an apartheid society, and the Palestinians that live there, whether they are occupied or they're citizens, are second-class citizens, and they don't have all the rights that everybody else does, and life is hard for them, or harder for them in a lot of ways than it is for the Jewish community. And I'm not saying there are poor Jewish people in Israel as well, but you get the drift here. We've got two tracks. Israel has two tracks, the Jewish track and everybody else, and it's a big problem.
Did you notice a discrepancy in how individuals viewed Israel at that time, whether they were foreign-born or born there in Israel? What Israel was doing? Because obviously your friend from Uruguay came in to see that and was opposed to it. Do you think that had he been born there, his view might have been different?
I don't know. They have there's a word in Hebrew for a native born, sabra. There's a hummus with the brand name of Sabra. Well, that's what Sabra means in Hebrew. It's the native born. And I can't tell you. I can tell you this, that the Zionists way back from 48 forward to all the way through have hoped that all the Jews in the world would move to Israel. They call it Aliyah. It's the coming back home, coming back to the promised land. And the reality is that they haven't. I think there are more Jews in New York City than in Israel.
Really?
I think so. I haven't seen the numbers lately, but New York has proven to be a fairly safe place as cities go for Jews to live in. And even Irish can live in New York City now. And that's kind of the American approach, that, Americans hate all the immigrants, no matter, what, as the years go by. They hate the Irish, they hate the Italians. Then, okay, well, we hate the Polacks, but we'll let them in. Okay, fine. Now we hate the Mexicans and we hate the Chinese. And, Americans hate anyone that's coming over, but eventually they kind of get over it, and those people become Americans, and we have a holiday. We have Cinco de Mayo for all you Mexicans, and we kind of tip the hat to this kind of melting pot. I think of it more of a salad, because I don't think we all melt
Salad's probably a better way to look at it.
Yeah, it's more like, there's some habaneros over there, and there's some kale, whatever. So we have this kind of culture of salad, where you've got different groups living in maybe, in their own neighborhoods, but in proximity to others. And of course, all of that stuff eventually, causes problems. Hang on just a second. Sorry. Diversity causes problems, but you try to move through it and embrace people for who they are, and accept that they are who they are, and you are you, and, that's not mutually exclusive. And so, I think, I was hoping, I guess, that as time went on and the people who were like Menachem Begin's age, you ever heard of Menachem Begin? Okay,
No.
Menachem Begin was like the first Netanyahu. He was back in the 70s and the 80s. He was the make Greater Israel great again guy. And the Likud party, hardline Zionists. Menachem Begin had been in a terrorist group that were fighting the British during the British Mandate after the dismantling of the Ottoman Empire, and that's a whole other story about the whole mess that the Brits. I mean, the Brits just have made life miserable everywhere. I'm sorry, and I'm part British too, and I love James Bond and those British people, but they just their imperial program was a disaster for everybody involved, and so after World War I, and then after World War II, the British felt that they needed to sort of set everybody straight in the Middle East, and they divided it all up. And France got these countries, and Britain got these countries, and we're gonna help create democracies out of them, and they'll learn tea and all the good things we have, and so the British just really screwed things up, and the partition of Israel in 1948 should never happened. It's like it was not agreed to by anybody, and it was just the British said, "Okay, we're out of here. You guys figure it out," and it became a war, and it was just awful. But as time goes on, now you got Netanyahu. He's an old guy. And you figure, hopefully there are younger people coming up who don't have that baggage or don't have the same kind of sense of danger that maybe, the earliest Zionists had, that they're coming out of Europe and they just had the Holocaust, and oh my God, Jews just can't get rid of anti-Semitism unless we control the land. And maybe that sentiment becomes more diffused as time goes by. And, well, yeah, we didn't have another Holocaust, and it's working out. We're making friends with our Arab neighbors, and this is going to work out. But I haven't seen it happen, and I haven't. The polls that I've seen or the stories I've seen out of Israeli press indicate that a lot of Israel's current population think that the war in Gaza is needed.
That's what I was going to say, is it almost feels like they've become more radicalized, especially post-October 7th.
Yeah. So that's kind of sad that we can't just seem to let go of some of the past.
That idea of Greater Israel, I mean, it almost feels like we're on the brink of that in some ways.
Yeah.
You hear that they're trying to occupy southern Syria, they're bombing Lebanon. It
Right.
feels like this is the push right now.
No, exactly. I mean, when you've been given the map, and I've had this map in my folder now for 40 years, and it's like, yeah, it's happening. It just took a long time, but the notion that, and this is all, Likud represents this. Likud, like I said, you could call them like MAGA, but I would call it what is it? MIGIT or something. Make Greater Israel great again, or MIGIT. So yeah, let's take all that land and eventually that'll be Israel. And it's a very ambitious program, and it's caused a lot of pain, and it has made a lot of enemies. And that's the irony to me, that what Israel has done, the Zionistic program of Israel, what they have done with the aim of making Jews safe once and for all, has made Israel the most dangerous place for Jews in the world. Totally ironic now. That shouldn't be the way it is. Why should New York be more Jew-friendly than Israel? It's like, why would anyone want to go over there now? If you're trying to draw the world Jewry out of diaspora and back into the homeland,
What's the incentive now?
You've created like a really dangerous place for them to want to come, So I don't know what the immigration numbers look like, but I can't imagine that the Jews across the world really want to go there.
I just don't understand the American perspective in all of this. And I don't get why we are so gung-ho to support this, even across these past presidencies. I mean, even looking at Biden and now Trump, there's just no desire to push back, it feels. And I'm definitely naive, but I don't see why. It seems like we will support at any cause, regardless of if it burns Israel even more, regardless of if it burns us abroad. This is just, I mean, like Trump said, we'll just take over Gaza.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of talk about how the Israeli lobby kind of controls
AIPAC.
Yeah, it controls the political life of the country, and I kind of think, well, that sounds very simplistic, but given some of the things that have happened since October 7th on campuses and in elections, when AIPAC came after some progressive Democrats who had been critical of Israel and got them unseated with more mainstream Democrats. I mean, it's like, wow, there really is a powerful, well-heeled Jewish lobby that does have impact on elections and policy in a way that's way disproportionate for their numbers. And I think this is also true in our Iranian history, that we've got people that would like to see Iran destroyed. And, one of these people is Sheldon Adelman, the casino magnate. He's passed away now, but, giving millions and millions and millions of dollars to every possible group he could that would seed discord with Iran. And his widow has carried that on, that grand tradition of dumping lots of money on people who are willing to go kill Iranians and kill Arabs. That's good. And I guess I've been convinced that the whole AIPAC thing might be true, that there might be enough money being passed around that it makes a difference. So, and we've talked about this before, how much money runs our so-called democracy. You need money, and all the congressmen, Jared Huffman's our congressman. He's no different than the rest of them. January 1st rolls around, time to start campaigning again. I just got something because I'm on his mailing list for intelligence gathering purposes. It's Jared's birthday. Donate to his campaign. So it's like this endless fundraising, this endless collecting of money and the spending of money, the election business. The Jewish lobby has a lot of impact, and
it's bipartisan sport.
Mm-hmm.
It's not one side that really just falls in line. It's both of them.
Right. And when I say the Jewish lobby, I'm not trying to say that all Jews would agree with that. There are a lot of Jews that don't. And in the last year, we've seen them come forward, Jewish Voices for Peace and Jews that are against the Likud Netanyahu program, and Jews that have come out in Arcata and said, let's have everybody, let's have a Sukkot celebration together, and let's talk, and let's be friends. There are a lot of Jews that aren't down with that program or are embarrassed by that program, or maybe like a lot of us Americans in general feel like there's nothing much we can do about it. The train is moving way too fast, and what am I supposed to do? Stand in front of it and get run over? I mean, I'm not going to be able to stop it. So there's maybe some of that, but the money is huge, I think, and documentable. And there we are.
Do you think it's just a money thing? Because that's one of those tinfoil hat conspiracies that gets thrown around, and maybe there's some credence somewhere in there that with Mossad that there's some intelligence also involved, and maybe some, they've got some dirt on some Congress people or something to kind of influence that.
Don't get me started on Mossad, but yeah, I mean,
you're not a fan?
Well, put it this way: I'm not a fan of the CIA. One of the fundamental problems with the CIA is that you have to lie to be in the CIA. So if you are an employee of the CIA, especially if you're in covert operations, you have to tell everybody in your family and all your friends that you do something else. You're in imports, or you're a consultant or something, So you have to lie to be in the CIA. So I think that's a huge problem. I think you probably have to kill to be in the Mossad. It's just, they are just beyond the pale, and in their willingness to do whatever they see fit. And I think that people, if you want to get conspiratorial about it, I think that anytime something in the world happens and you're going, I wonder who did that. I wonder who blew up Nord Stream. I wonder who did 9/11. Whatever kind of disaster happens and intelligence organizations are involved, we typically don't think of Mossad. They're like, but we saw what Mossad pulled off with Hezbollah, with getting them a bunch of pagers that they could explode.
How crazy was that?
So yeah, I mean, that's straight out of the.
That's a James
Bond Q.
Yeah.
Q came up with a really good one. He found a way to get 1,000 pagers in the pockets of the enemy. So I think Mossad is capable of anything. And the Israelis have shown that they can build computer software that spies on the people who use it, and are perfectly willing to do anything. And that comes from that Zionistic reptile that says, we will not be safe. We will not be safe until we control our little land. And, all this bloodshed and all this world turmoil is over a bunch of desert, and you go over there and it's like, okay, it's nice and all. And it has a certain ancient charm to it. But, this isn't Humboldt. This isn't the redwood forest. This isn't the Amazon River and the glaciers of Switzerland. This is desert. It's not hospitable at all. And we're going to go kill and maybe move the whole world towards annihilation over it. Kind of crazy. So, I'd just like to leave you with the idea that as much as possible, I think Americans need to meet people. Get off of social media and meet people. Meet Arabs, meet Muslims, meet Jews. Meet people that you think might be your enemy. And you'll probably find that they're not much different than you. And try to rehumanize the world and get away from these labels and this historical, cultural baggage that we all seem to be carrying around like a bunch of chains. And that's what I was able to do. And I'm really grateful for that time. And if you want to read more about it, Return to Gaza is on Truthsmack, stephensaint.substack.com, and I have a version of it on the Catholic Farmer, abufrancis.substack.com. And my little memoir of Return to Gaza, and I just recently did the Silence the West Bank about the aid workers on. So that's my contribution to meeting people and telling their story.
That's a great contribution. What I want to end with this here, where do you think this leads from here? What happens over the next few months? If you had to place a bet, what do you see happening?
I don't think that the problem will be solved. I think that's a pretty safe bet. It hasn't been solved so far. What I see is that negotiating isn't being done in good faith, that parties come to the table and they've got set agendas. The pattern that I see with Israel in particular, because Israel has a longer track record of negotiating than Hamas does, the pattern I see in Israel is get what you can even to come to the table. So that's part of what Israel does, is says, we're not even going to come to the table unless you give us something. So you got to give in concessions just to have us negotiate. And so once you've shown that you'll give up something, we'll talk to you. And then we'll have this phases where you give up something and we'll give up something. And then we'll go on and see if we can give up more, or you can give up more. But it's always kind of give me what I want first, and then we'll go from there. Very tough negotiating style. So that's what we've seen with this so-called ceasefire, is that we're going to have these hostages released. We're going to release some of your people. Oh, we were supposed to stop shooting? The ceasefire was in there somewhere, wasn't it? Forget that. But let's focus on these hostages, and right away, I mean, Israel didn't engage in a ceasefire. And they can point fingers all they want, but they got some of their hostages out, and that's what they want to do. They want to get all the hostages out, so I guess they can nuke the place or something. I don't know. And Hamas is like, oh, maybe we should keep a few. They're going to nuke us as soon as we give all our hostages. I mean, it's bad faith negotiating, and Israel is coming to the table with I think a deviousness about a ruthlessness. We're going to get something, maybe we'll give something, but that's of less concern. You just can't negotiate that way.
Yeah, not if you actually want to achieve anything.
So that would be, I hope I'm wrong. I tell you, Nick, I hope I'm wrong about almost everything I say. That would be nice.
Okay, well, thanks, Steve. We'll see you next time.
All right.